in my diary. All of us clean stuff. And Terry is extraordinary. We have a lot of champions here today. No greater champion than Terry. She has sadly been diagnosed with terminal metastatic cancer. She's in the midst of her debilitating chemotherapy, and she flew all the way here from Albuquerque, New Mexico, just to support me today in this event. Thank you, Terry. So having completed the introduction part of the agenda, I'm going to move right into the dedication remarks so we can keep going and get to the MREs that I know everybody's wanting to partake on. I want to again thank all of you for joining us for this historic event. The class of 1969 Navy Crew Racing Shell, which we are christening and launching today, provides a unique linkage to each of the entities we are celebrating and honoring. As detailed on page 18 of your commemorative program, it directly honors and celebrates my Naval Academy class of 1969 by its name bearing the class of 1969 year. And if you look inside the shell, by having the 1969 crest and the 1969 motto permanently affixed to its skin. And by having this christening and launch, I had one more flyby just to make sure you all saw what we had set out for you. And by having this christening and launch being held during our class of 1969 50th anniversary. And while honoring our class of 1969 by year and dedication and motto on our 50th anniversary, by retaining the Blackledge name on the shell, it also honors my father and our legacy class of 1920, which was my father's class. And by that linkage, it further honors Navy Crew on its 150th anniversary, because the class of 1920 was the first Naval Academy class to represent the United States in the Olympics. And the Naval Academy won the 1920 Olympic gold medal, which not only broke a long accepted stereotype that rowing was only for the privileged elite, it also led to the longest winning streak in a single sport in Olympic history. And finally, as detailed in pages 18 through 22 of your commemorative program, this shell directly honors my beloved father by completing the Alpha Omega series, which was started in 1984 by our donation of the Captain Allen Blackledge racing shell, which you will see displayed in its permanent place of honor in the Varsity Awards room, affixed to the ceiling until eternity, during your tour of Hubbard Hall. So Dad, when I was growing up, used to refer to himself as the Alpha, as the progenitor of all of us minion Blackledges, and me as the Omega, his last child. And so his first shell, the Captain Allen Blackledge in 1984, we donated as the Alpha shell. Today is the Peter Blackledge, the Omega shell. So we went from Alpha to Omega in those years. And on page 7 of your commemorative program, you will see the 1920 Lucky Bag pictures of my father, and you'll also see his impressive All-American football classmate, Lyman Perry. Now, I don't know if Lyman made it today. I didn't see him stand up. But Lyman Perry is one of the class of 1960 Olympic oarsmen, and his father was my father's classmate in the 1920s, which makes me wonder what kind of super Wheaties these Perry men eat, because I would like to buy some. But as plebes in the class of 1920, Lyman's and my father's literally marched through history, not only marching in President Woodrow Wilson's second inaugural parade, but also in the funeral of Admiral Dewey, the only person in the U.S. history to have attained the rank of Admiral of the Navy. And apparently the relationship between the lowly plebe and the exalted platoon leader hasn't changed much, because just before that parade for President Wilson started, my dad requested from his platoon leader permission to use the restroom, only to have his platoon leader growl back at him, "What do you think your leggings are for, mister?" Some of my class of 1969 might say, "But Pete, the class of 1920 suffered through World War I and the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, which killed 675,000 Americans. Two major catastrophes. How can we possibly relate to that?" I would remind my classmates that our class of 1969 also suffered through two major catastrophes. We twice lost the Army-Navy game. Well, one thing I noticed about Naval Academy graduates back in the 1920s is they were an extraordinarily close and collegial fraternity. And as I was researching my dad's background for today's event, historical names kept popping up. You know, there was a popular game back in the 80s called 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, the objective of which was to show that every actor was somehow, through 6 steps, related to Kevin Bacon. So I decided to play 6 Navy degrees of Alan Blackledge, and I had some interesting findings. On page 25 of your commemorative program, you will see my dad with 4-star Admiral Jonas Ingram, who, by the way, a Navy crew oarsman, for whom the destroyer USS Jonas Ingram was named. That photo bears Admiral Ingram's note, "To my friend." On that same page, you will see Dad with 5-star Fleet Admiral William Leahy, the first U.S. naval officer ever to hold a 5-star rank in the U.S. Armed Forces, and for whom the destroyer USS Leahy was named. And my dad's Legion of Merit was signed by James Forrestal, the first United States Secretary of Defense, and for whom the Forrestal Building was named. But in retrospect, the most amazing example to me occurred when I was a midshipman at the Naval Academy. I mentioned to my dad in a phone call that I was going to write my term paper on the, quote, Bay of Pigs invasion. And my father casually mentioned back to me, "Well, then you should go talk to my friend Arleigh Burke." Well, I had no idea who Arleigh Burke was, and I have to sadly admit that I was still unaware of who Arleigh Burke was when I went into his office to interview him. And my dad's friend Arleigh stood up and, with a huge smile on his face, thrust out his large hand and bellowed, "It's a great pleasure to meet Blackie's son." Well, it wasn't until later, much later, that I found out this was not just Dad's friend Arleigh. This was legendary World War II combat hero Arleigh Burke, iconic 31 knots Arleigh Burke, longest serving chief of naval operations in history Arleigh Burke, and the man for whom an entire class of destroyers were subsequently named. But to my dad, Arleigh Burke was just another friend. So then I started looking into whether that 6-degree phenomenon extended to my mother. I found that my mother, who was born 13 years, think about this, ladies, 13 years before women had the right to vote, in her 9 short years after college, amassed an amazing resume, serving on the historic 1931 League of Nations Pepin Commission, participating at the U.S. Ambassador's request in a reception for aviation hero Charles Lindbergh, and even accompanying President Calvin Coolidge on his trip to Cuba aboard the battleship Texas. And to win the hearts of all the oarsmen here, my mom even rowed competitive crew for the Yokohama Boat Club. But to bring that 6 degrees even closer home to us here today, if you look on page 27, you'll see you'll see my mother, that was Freudian, wasn't it? You'll see my mother escorting the wife of the incoming commanding officer for Naval Ordnance Plant Indianapolis around Napi, just before he relieves my father at his last command. And you'll see that the caption on that newspaper photo states that my mother is showing around, was Mrs. Miles Hubbard. Well, if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because Captain Miles Hubbard was a cousin of Rear Admiral John Hubbard, the champion Naval Academy oarsman who stroked the Naval Academy crew to victory in 1870 and for whom this building was named. Wow, 6 degrees. Well, but I hadn't gotten through yet, because there's more that was even more amazing to me. On page 28, you will see a plaque here at the Naval Academy which bears the name of my brother, a 1963 Naval Academy graduate, due to his graduating first in his class in mathematics, for which he was also personally presented a sword by then President Lyndon Johnson. But my brother had little interest in athletics. In his own words, if he ever gets the urge to exercise, he, quote, lies down until it goes away.
He does.
A photo of my own personal encounter with a U.S. president can be seen on that same page. In 1973, I was a lovely lieutenant on the cruiser USS Albany. We had just returned from a six-month Mediterranean deployment, and I was selected to be command duty officer in total charge of the ship. As the commanding officer, the executive officer, all the department heads, every single officer, except this lowly lieutenant that was junior CDO, so he got stuck with the duty, went ashore for the weekend. And the next morning at 8 o'clock, my shipmate, David Eisenhower, knocked on my door and apologetically, with a wry smile on his face, said, "Hey, Pete, I didn't want to tell the captain this, because he would have had everybody out painting the ship over the holiday weekend, but my father-in-law, then President Nixon, is coming aboard for a little surprise visit to my ship today to see where I work." So the picture shows me wearing a newly fashionable Zumwalt beard, if you remember those days, welcoming President Nixon aboard Albany. And that's just another typical Navy day in the fleet, to have the President and the Commander-in-Chief standing at the foot of my brow, asking me for permission to come aboard my ship. But here's the amazing thing. Perhaps the extraordinary 6th degree example can be seen in the news clippings on pages 28 and 29 of your commemorative program about the 1958 Cotton Bowl between the Naval Academy and Rice University. My fraternal twin sisters, Patty and Penny, were both seniors at Rice University at the time, and Penny had been elected both homecoming queen and Cotton Bowl queen. Well, the Naval Academy found out that my father was a 1920 graduate alumnus, so they asked him, "Hey, can her twin sister be our queen for the Cotton Bowl?" Dad said yes, of course. And so what you see is the only time in history that twins have been queens for opposing teams at a bowl game, riding around on the opposing team's floats. But here's the most amazing part. If you look closely at the page 28 newspaper picture of my sister Patty in the stands cheering Navy, you might notice that Patty's escort standing next to her may look familiar to you. Well, that's because Patty's escort for the game was Midshipman First Class and Brigade Commander Charles Larson, later 4-star Admiral Charles Larson, and Superintendent of this Naval Academy. It's amazing how 6 degrees works. So then I decided to pursue 6 degrees of Navy crew. Now, admittedly, I'm so old that all my memories are in black and white. But I have to say, I know it takes a while. Yeah, I have to say that the memories of my teammates were very colorful. 60 Olympic oarsman Lyman Perry recalls that if an oarsman wasn't pulling hard enough, Rusty Callow, legendary coach Rusty Callow, would yell at him, "Mister, you couldn't pull a sailor off your sister." You gotta try that line, Coach Friedrich, see if it works. See how long you get stayed employed here. 69 oarsman Pete Renfrey, where is Pete? There he is. Recalls fellow oarsman Charlie Nation keeping everybody falling over their oars laughing by loudly reciting full pages of steamy passages from X-rated novels. 69 coxswain Bill Hogan, over here, recalls nervously asking our plebe crew coach Lou Gellerman if he had any advice before Bill's first big race. Coach Gellerman responded, "Yeah, don't hit the bridge or any of the other racing shells." You can't knock that advice, I guess. 69 oarsman Steve Brixey confided to me that after over 50 years, he is still plagued by his memory of our first plebe race against Harvard and Penn, in which we were substantially leading both of those very strong teams, when Steve's oar suddenly got caught in the water, causing us to lose that race. Well, Bricks, wherever you are, I'm just here to say that I am willing to stand before this group of champion and Olympic oarsmen and say that after a half a century, I think you need to be forgiven for causing us to lose that very impressive and important race. But then again, I have to warn that we also have here hard asses Jim Hanneman and Rick Dempsey, because they were also on that racing shell. So wherever you are, Steve, if I were you, I'd keep on checking under your car before you turn on the ignition. 1969 oarsman Jim Borowski emailed me all the way from his current home in the Andes Mountains of Ecuador to recall our racing shell breaking into pieces as we attempted to row through violently choppy waters, with Jim saying that hypothermia he got from the extended immersion in the cold water, freezing cold water, was his closest brush ever with death. Here's one that got my attention. 70 coxswain John Newt vividly recalls looking up and seeing Coach Gellerman perched atop a bridge and then doing for one of his gut checks, as he often did, and then yelling, "Airborne!" and hurling himself off the bridge into the canal waters below, landing between the dying carp and the astonished water skiers. Now, Coach Clothier, I don't recall you're continuing that tradition, but maybe Coach Friedrich will pick it up. Everyone remembered the terror of the tongue depressors, in which an oarsman with the flick of a coach's wrist could sadly instantly drop from first boat to fourth boat. 67 oarsman Tom Knutson and 69 oarsman Rick Dempsey both recalled the entire varsity and junior varsity boats being completely flipped in 67 and again in 69. Multiple oarsmen recall our arising at 3:30 a.m. each morning to run countless rotunda steps behind our crew captain Denny Rowley, followed by endless miles of street runs and then 68 sets of Navy Marine Corps stadium steps, all under Coach Gellerman's plan to toughen us up for competing in the 68 Olympics. But definitely the most unique memory was told to me by our 69 classmate and captain John Collins, and it involved our classmate, teammate, and friend Michael Gimble. Now, I have to admit that when I first started my series of phone conversations with Michael Gimble's wonderful widow, Linda, I was reluctant to share John Collins' memory with her because it is so very unique. Finally, with Linda's encouragement, I, admittedly still with some trepidation, shared John Collins' memory. When Linda finally stopped laughing, she said, "Peter, that's a wonderful story. It is so very much Michael. He would love it. You simply have to share it with everybody at the shell christening." So at the urging of Linda, Michael's widow, and all of his family who are here today, here is John Collins' memory. John recalled coming out of Hubbard Hall after a crew practice, looking up and seeing our teammate Mike Gimble up in a tree, hanging upside down with a live snake in one hand. Mike said to John, "Hey John, come take my pet snake. Don't worry, he won't bite you." Now at this point in the story, I am convinced everybody in this audience knows exactly what's going to happen next. Unfortunately, our classmate John Collins apparently did not, because he reached up to take Mike Gimble's pet snake and it bit him ferociously and intensely and with gusto. John said he had a tough time explaining to all the folks at sickbay how he went to crew practice at Hubbard Hall and came back with a snake bite. Anyone who knew Michael knew how much he loved his pet snakes. That love brought out his most amazing skill. Michael should have been a diplomat or a negotiator, because he somehow managed to convince all three Navy varsity heavyweight crew coaches to let him keep his pet snakes here in Hubbard Hall. And then, when I rented a house in Annapolis after graduation, Michael also managed to convince me to allow his pet snakes to be our non-paying housemates. For me, that gave a whole new meaning to the term snake ranch. But something that perhaps Linda Gimbel doesn't know, and I hope she doesn't mind my disclosing here today, Michael and I first experienced our first true love as we approached our senior year. There is one picture in existence of both Michael with his first true love and me with my first true love. So Linda, if you won't be jealous, I'm going to disclose that picture now. If you turn to page 6, in the lower right hand of that page, you will see Michael and me in the background carrying a cruise shell down to the water. In the foreground of that picture, you will see my first true love in blue. Michael's first true love is in yellow. Michael's love was a bit too fast for my taste, but oh, how he loved that sports car. But however, now, 50 years later, I have no doubt that Michael's first true love is somewhere in a scrap heap in China. Fortunately, however, my first true love, that lady in blue, is here with me today, supporting me in this special event as she has done so lovingly, beautifully, and consistently for 52 years. Thank you, my cherished friend, Barb Blackledge. I am extraordinarily blessed to be supported here today, not only by my two best lady friends, Barb and Terry, and my two best guy friends, Bill and Mitch, but also, most importantly, by the love of my life, Laura Foy. Laura and I are best friends, we are deepest loves, and we are eternal soulmates. We have walked together hand in hand through life's joys and life's travails, and I could not imagine my life without her. Thank you, my sweet Laura, for all you are and all you've helped me to become. Wow. The final crew memory to share with you today comes from class of 1971 varsity heavyweight oarsman Lou Vest. Lou recounts that at the end of long, grueling crew practices, with hopes of rowing gently back to the comfort of Mother Hubbard, he inevitably would watch with exhausted dread as Coach Ulrich would rise from his coach's boat like a frightening horned apparition in a Wagnerian opera, raise his coach's megaphones to his lips, and boom out these chilling, feared 6 words. And now for dessert, the seawall. Challenging his weary oarsmen who thought they had nothing left to give, who felt they had left it all on the water, to dig even deeper, to find that final, ultimate effort that even they didn't know was there, to make that final rowing sprint down what seemed now to be an interminably long seawall. That extra effort by the 71 crew and that superb leadership by Coach Ulrich helped them to find their greatness, and is what made the extraordinary 71 team into EARC champions, upsetting the vaulted Pennsylvania and unbeaten Harvard varsity heavyweight teams to win the EARC for the first time in decades, and to become both VFW IRA national champions and 2V8 IRA national champions. And that extra effort is what made the 60 team into Olympians. Peter Boss, captain of that legendary USNA 1960 Olympic team, described to me that at the end of each crew practice, under iconic USNA crew coach Rusty Callow, the 60 oarsmen were so exhausted they would literally have to crawl out of their racing shells. In closing, on this historic day, honoring Navy crew on its 150th anniversary, I would like to attempt to answer the important question I am often asked. What's so special about rowing Navy crew? Certainly there are many Olympic and champion Navy oarsmen here today who are far more qualified than I to answer that question, but I'm going to try. On the inside of the front cover page of your commemorative program, you will see my quote, which is only part of my answer. You will also see there a photo from the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper reporting on the 1969 varsity heavyweight crew race between Navy, Harvard, and Penn for the coveted Adams Cup. You might have reasonably asked yourself, out of all of the Olympic and champion boatings which Navy crew has produced, why would Pete pick that photo to honor Navy crew? Certainly that photograph captures many exciting elements of competitive collegiate rowing. The crowds of spectators lining the sides of the river, cheering loudly as three major collegiate crews are locked in fierce battle. The Navy shell is in the foreground, and you can clearly see the intensity in our faces and in our musculature as we are reaching down deep to drive every stroke with every fiber of our being. That's an extraordinary photograph, but like all photographs, it's only one snapshot on the arc of history. But if we fast forward a half century to our historic event today, we are able to receive the full answer. The foreman in that racing shell was Michael Gimble, whom we lost to cancer in 2014. The bowman in that racing shell was Frank Montesano, whom we lost to cancer last year. The two-man in that racing shell was Mike Malone, whom we lost to cancer this year. And the five-man in that racing shell is Stu Miller, whom we are sadly currently losing to Alzheimer's disease. And here am I, the sixth man. But if you were able to talk to those four oarsmen or to their families, as I was privileged to do, they would all, without exception, tell you that rowing varsity heavyweight Navy crew was one of the proudest and most treasured experiences of their life. And for those who don't understand my somewhat arcane reference to Rosebud and my quote honoring Navy crew on that page, the name Rosebud is from the final scene in the iconic movie Citizen Kane, in which Citizen Kane, a man who had achieved the pinnacle of wealth, power, and prestige, lies dying. His final memory, his last yearning, his final words were of when he was young and reveling in joyful and fulfilling time with his sled, Rosebud. All his worldly trappings, which he had spent his entire life pursuing, all of a sudden seemed to him to be suddenly so insignificant. In his final minutes, it was that one memory, those unique glory days, which alone brought him joy and solace. In the last email I received from Mike Malone, Mike wrote to me of our race, which you see on that page just inside the front cover of your commemorative program. He wrote the following to me in his email, quote, Pete, I have many memories from my time on the water, but none as crystal clear as the 1969 Harvard-Penn Navy race. At 1,000 meters, I recall seeing both Harvard and Penn. By the finish, they were ahead, but I was certain there was nothing left in the tank. And thank you for connecting so many of us, Mike Malone. Vice Admiral Mike Malone was scheduled to be a distinguished guest here today. Just weeks before his passing, Mike Malone was on the phone with me, again, talking about rolling Navy crew. Mike candidly told me, Pete, I don't know if I'm going to make it to October, but if I can, I'll be there. Mike Malone passed away just weeks after our phone call. A man who was blessed with a wonderful family and an extraordinary career, just weeks before his death, was taking some of his precious final minutes of life talking about rowing Navy crew. And that's what's so special about rowing Navy crew. And that's why each of us here today, particularly the ancient mariner oarsmen like me, who, like the oarsmen of the 1960 and 1971 champion teams, may find ourselves weary, exhausted, and challenged. But we are here today for this glorious Navy crew event because we are not giving up or giving in as we find ourselves Now, and perhaps our final row down the seawall, we are each reaching down and digging deeply, each giving our best in our final row, and giving ebullient thanks and praise to God to be able to be here today, to honor this extraordinary US Naval Academy, this hallowed Hubbard Hall, our cherished classmates, our beloved band of brothers teammates, and this esteemed Navy crew program, which has brought us all together, to christen and launch this class of 1969 racing shell, so that we may pass the torch to the next generation of Navy crew varsity heavyweight oarsmen, enabling them to have their own glory days. And to, in their final hours, 50 years from now, perhaps, like our varsity heavyweight crew teammates, Michael Gimbel, Frank Montesano, and Mike Malone, find substance and solace in their own precious rosebud memories of rowing Navy crew. May God bless them, and may God bless each of you. Thank you.